So welcome to the Jacob K. Javits Visiting Professor Lecture, an event that is co-hosted by New York University and the Marion B. and Jacob K. Javits Foundation. Our lecture tonight is presented by Jorge Castañeda, Global Distinguished Professor of Politics and Latin American and Caribbean Studies in our Faculty of Arts and Science. I am David McLaughlin, Provost of New York University. I and my co-host, Tom Carew, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science, thank you for joining us this evening. We have a diverse audience which reflects Jorge Castañeda's distinguished career and the very timely nature of tonight's lecture, BRICs, human rights, and the new international legal order. Please join me in greeting the trustees and leadership of the Jacob K. Javits Foundation, Mr. Jeffrey C. Kyle, and Ms. Patrick K. Perlman, and in his absence, the Honorable William Vanderhoeven. I also ask you to join me in welcoming Mrs. Marion B. Javits, whose generosity has made possible the Jacob K. Javits Visiting Professorship here at NYU. Thank you, Marion. Mrs. Javits is accompanied by her daughter, Carla Javits, and her son, Joshua Javits. And I'm very pleased to welcome Carla and Joshua to NYU and appreciate you traveling to New York City to join us at this special occasion, which celebrates the wonderful legacy of your father, Senator Jacob K. Javits. Marion Javits is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Jacob K. Javits Foundation. She is the widow of the four-term Republican U.S. Senator from New York, the late Jacob K. Javits. From 1946 to 1954, Jacob Javits represented the New York 21st Congressional District, including Manhattan's Upper West Side, in the U.S. House of Representatives. An alumnus of the NYU Law School, he ran against the Democratic candidate Franklin Roosevelt Jr. and was elected to the New York State Attorney General in 1954. In 1956, he defeated the Democratic candidate, Mayor Robert F. Wagner Jr., and was elected to the U.S. Senate. During his 4 terms in the U.S. Senate, Jacob K. Javits introduced legislation that became the War Powers Act of 1973, and among his many activities, he was a strong advocate of the ERISA Act, Employment Retirement Income Security Act, and a supporter of the National Endowment for the Arts and the Humanities. In the 1980s, Senator Javits joined the faculty of Columbia University, its School of International Affairs. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1983. Jacob K. Javits died on March 7, 1986. Marion Javits is in her own right a distinguished arts consultant and patron of music and the arts. She has served on several state and national boards dealing with the arts and the humanities, women's issues, and the mentally handicapped. Tonight, we honor Mrs. Marion Javits and the memory of her late husband, Senator Jacob K. Javits. It is the mission of the Jacob K. Javits Foundation to encourage excellence in public service and to support the next generation of students and scholars in this pursuit. This was the goal of the Senator during his lifetime and a commitment that Mrs. Marion Javits has nurtured during the past decades as head of the Javits Foundation. The Jacob K. Javits Visiting Professorship was established at NYU to honor the memory of the late Senator and to perpetuate the values and intellectual integrity for which he stood. The Jacob K. Javits Visiting Professorship is awarded to a distinguished individual, an academic, a lawyer, policymaker, journalist, historian, philosopher, or former elected official whose work focuses on an issue close to the Senator's interests. These areas include health, civil rights, labor, foreign policy, rights of handicapped individuals, education, and fairness in employment and in economic security. The Jacob K. Javits Visiting Professorship at NYU was inaugurated in 2008. Previous honorees are Howard Gardner, the Hobbs Professor of Cognition and Education at Harvard University, its Graduate School of Education; David Oshinsky, the Jack S. Blanton Professor of History at the University of Texas in Austin; and Pete Hamill, Distinguished Writer in Residence at NYU's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. In a few moments, Thomas Carew will introduce Jorge Castañeda. Tom Carew is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science and Professor of Neuroscience at New York University, a renowned scholar and author of over 180 scholarly articles and 3 books. Dean Carew's research focuses on the behavioral, cellular, and molecular analysis of learning and memory. Among his many honors, Dean Carew is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science and has served as president of the Society of Neuroscience. Please welcome Dean Thomas Carew, who will introduce our speaker.
Well, it is a real honor to have a chance to introduce our speaker this evening, Jorge Castañeda, who is the Jacob Javits Visiting Professor and Global Distinguished Professor of Politics and Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Professor Castañeda is a renowned public intellectual, a political scientist, a prolific writer with interests in Latin American politics, comparative politics, and U.S.-American relationships. He is the former foreign minister to Mexico from 2000 to 2003. And while serving in that role, he focused on diverse issues of U.S.-Mexican relationships, including migration, trade, drug control, and security. He also participated in many diplomatic initiatives, including part of the forging of relationships of Latin American nations and the promotion of Mexican economics and relations globally. Born in Mexico in 1953, Professor Castañeda received undergraduate degrees from both Princeton University and from the University of Paris. He got his PhD in the history of economics, also from the University of Paris. And then he has taught in Mexico's National Autonomous University, Princeton, and Berkeley University. Dr. Castañeda was a senior associate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace from 1985 to 1987. And he was the recipient of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Award for Research and Writing in 1989 to 1991. Among his many books include Utopia Unarmed, The Latin American Left After the Cold War, The Mexican Shock, Compañero, The Life and Death of Che Guevara, and Perpetuating Power, How the Mexican Presidents Were Chosen. Dr. Castañeda is a regular columnist for the Mexican Daily Reforma, the Los Angeles Times, and Newsweek International. The title of his talk today is BRICs, the Human Rights and National and New International Legal Order. Before I turn the lectern over to Professor Castañeda, I want to say to everybody we would welcome you joining us after his talk to your left, to my right, for a lovely reception. We have a chance to chat with him personally. And now please join me in welcoming our guest tonight, Dr. Castañeda.
Thank you, Dean Carew. Thank you, Provost. And thank you, Mrs. Javits. I would particularly wish to thank the Marion B. and Jacob K. Javits Foundation for bestowing this visiting professorship upon me, and also for inviting me to present this talk, which I hope will make a little more sense than its title. which I agree with some of you who might think it's utterly incomprehensible, but that's my fault, and I will try to make some sense of it. Start with the term BRICs, which originally was written the way it is in the invitation, 4 capital letters and a small s. The 4 capital letters were Brazil, Russia, India, China, and the S was because there were 4 of them. It's a plural. Generally, plural words have an S at the end. So that's why it was put there. Now, this term was coined by a guy, an economist at Goldman Sachs. So that they actually do useful things every now and then. Not too often, but anyway. Exactly 10 years ago, I think, if I'm not mistaken, this month is the 10th anniversary of the day or the moment when the term was coined. And it was coined by these economists, or this economist at Goldman Sachs, for a simple economic, financial investment reason. Goldman Sachs, as some of you may have heard, is in the business of making money. And one of the ways they make money is investing in places where they're going to make more money than elsewhere before other people do it. That's their job. And this guy they had working for them and the people who work there decided that these 4 countries, the BRICs, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, were going to become a much larger and important part of the world economy than they had been until then, and that this was a very interesting new trend emerging in the world economy, and that their investors, their clients, their customers should take advantage of it. And so they coined this term, and they churned out a series of studies, papers, reports, etc., explaining why these 4 countries were going to be increasingly important in the world economy. In terms of manufacturing, first in terms of population, which you don't necessarily need to work at Goldman Sachs to figure that one out. The world has about 6 billion inhabitants, a little more. There's 2.5 billion in China and India. Well, you just do the numbers, you can see it's rather important. It's roughly 40% of the world's population. But that in addition, given economic growth, which had been going on for several years, given the type of accelerated growth, urbanization, literacy campaigns, health campaigns, etc., these 4 countries, including, of course, Russia, which had been around for a long time, as the Soviet Union before then, and then Russia, and Brazil, which was sort of the new kid on the block, these 4 countries would turn out to represent a larger and larger share of the world's population, of the world's GDP, of world's consumption, of world trade, particularly China, which represents a greater share of world trade than it does of world economic production because of the type of economy it has, an export-oriented economy, that they would represent inevitably, with time, growing clout politically, militarily, culturally, and that this was a good place to invest. This acronym of BRICS was one of the huge success stories as far as acronyms go. The Canadians in particular, and the people who work at the UN, love acronyms. I don't know why the Canadians do, but the UN people do, and the reason they do is because they have to say all these things all the time, and if they don't shorten them, then it's very complicated for them. So anyway, it had enormous fortune because it quickly became known in all specialized and even not so specialized circles as a short-term version of emerging markets, emerging economies, emerging powers. All of this then began 10 years ago as a strictly economic phenomenon. But as the Goldman Sachs people expected, it quickly acquired a political and geopolitical repercussion or extension. Why did it do that? Well, for a bunch of reasons, but there's one in particular which was very important. The one very important one is that about 10 years ago also, a little bit less actually, in the year 2000, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, along with what you may have heard of the Millennium Goals, that he and a number of heads of state, about 60, put together in the year 2000 at the UN here. He also embarked upon an attempt, a failed attempt as it were, to reform the United Nations system, and particularly to reform the jewel in the crown, which is the United Nations Security Council. As you know, the UN Security Council is the only instance of the United Nations that can determine the use of force, that can apply sanctions to other countries, and it is the maximum instance in the world of defense of peace and security and enforcement of the UN Charter. It is the jewel in the crown. The problem with it, of course, is that it was set up along with the rest of the UN in 1945, right after the war. And the composition of the Security Council, for those of you who are not familiar with it necessarily, reflects the balance of forces that existed in the world after the war. At the time, there were 12 members, 5 permanent members, and 7 non-permanent or rotating members. Who were the 5 permanent members? Well, the 5 countries that theoretically won the war. Why do I say theoretically? Well, you'll see in a second. First country, yes, the United States, makes sense, it won, clearly. Second country, Soviet Union, it won too. At a horrible price, more than 20 million dead, but it won. Third, the United Kingdom, they won too. Just how much they participated in victory is arguable with the Brits, as everything else is arguable with them, but they did. Let's grant them that. Then come 2 funny ones. First, China. Now, China, well, in 1945, there was a strange China. There was China, was mainland and Taiwan, and it was governed by Chiang Kai-shek, by the nationalist leader who had led the country in the war. The problem he had was that 4 years later, he was going to be overthrown and thrown out. And he would be sent to a little island called Taiwan off the coast of China, and where he would continue to represent China, because that's the way the United States wanted it to be, for the following 30 years approximately. So China was considered a victor of World War II. Not clear exactly why, but a lot of people, they were there. The Japanese had done all sorts of terrible things to them, which was true. So they became permanent members of the Security Council. But the Chinese representation was not held by the people who took over in 1949, by Mao and the Communist Party, but by Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan. And that lasted until 1972, if I'm not mistaken. And then finally came the French. Now, how exactly you can figure out why the French, and I like the French, believe me, I'm one of the few Francophiles there are in this city, et cetera, et cetera. I'm a big French fan. But, you know, exactly how much did the French contribute to the Allies' victory in World War II is arguable, other than de Gaulle figuring out a way to enter Paris before Patton did in August of 1944. Other than that, it's not clear exactly what they did. But anyway, everybody wanted to be nice to the French, because you're not nice to the French, they get very upset about it, and they can be real nuisance. When the French are upset, they're a nuisance. So France was also allowed in. So that's the 5. And then there were 7 countries from each region in the world that would rotate every 2 years. Now, these 5 countries were not only permanent members, they had veto power, which means that no matter what everybody else in the Security Council wanted, if any one of those 5 didn't want it, it wouldn't happen. And this situation lasted without any changes, except 2 until the year 2000. The 2 changes being, at one point, the number was increased from 12 to 15, basically to make room for the newly decolonized countries of Africa and Asia. And second, the Chinese representation went from Taiwan to Beijing. Fine. Then, around the year 2000, a number of people started looking at the UN and the composition and saying, well, look, there's something a little strange here. The world's 2nd most populated country, India, is not a permanent member. The world's 2nd economy, Japan at the time, is not a permanent member. The world's third largest economy, especially after German reunification, Germany, is not a permanent member. And Brazil, which is the 6th or 7th most populated country in the world and comes from a region which is also very important in the world, Latin America, is not a permanent member. So we have to reform the Security Council. So they came up with this idea, and they created a thing called the P4. 4 countries who wanted to become permanent members: Germany, Japan, Brazil, and India. All of which made a great deal of sense, except for the permanent 5 who were already there. For them, it didn't make a lot of sense. Why? Because when you have a privileged situation, you don't share it with anybody. That's the way things are in life. And of course, the decision to increase the number of permanent members was going to be made by who? By the permanent members. So it wasn't going to happen. So this was a second expression of this movement, but now a political or geopolitical expression. Why was it that? Well, because 2 of the BRICs were members of the P4, and 2 of the P4 members, Brazil and India, were part of the BRICs. But then something else happened which was very important. You couldn't really talk about BRICs, Europe through Russia, Asia through China and India, South America or Latin America through Brazil, and just leave the Africans out. Not nice, and not accurate, not a good idea. So you had to find an African country that you could make part of both the BRICs and the P5. P4 plus 1, 5. Why? Because Africa has a lot of votes in the UN General Assembly where you can also make changes. So then everybody went sort of shopping for an African country. Who can we bring in? Not because of the size of their population. There's no country populated enough to really warrant it. Nigeria is the most populated country in Africa, and it's got about 110, 120 million people, which is about what Mexico has, Indonesia has more, Pakistan has more. If you get into that mess, you'll never finish, because everybody's got a lot of people. It's also not, there's no country with a big economy in Africa. It's a poor continent with poor countries, small economies. But there was one country which was emblematic for all sorts of reasons, but mainly because it had had a glorious, epic, heroic, and successful transition from one of the most hateful regimes in the world, the apartheid regime, to democracy under Mandela. So who are we going to choose? South Africa. So what happened to the S at the end of BRICS? It turned into a capital S for South Africa. And we also had a P5, in a sense. We want an African permanent member of the Security Council, because it would really not be nice to have someone from another European, the Japanese, etc., and no African. So South Africa became involved there. So then you began to have a broader expression of emerging economies or markets, plus emerging political leaders in their regions, and then with some additional aspects of rising countries. China, militarily. The Chinese began to do what all big, powerful, and increasingly rich countries do. They get themselves all sorts of nice toys to play with. Submarines, aircraft carriers, bombers, missiles, nuclear weapons, which they had since the 60s. This is what these countries do. When you become a big country, you get all this stuff. And the Chinese military and navy began to be an increasingly important power in the world. Brazil began to try and enhance and develop its leadership in Latin America. Began to pick fights all the time with the other Latin American kid on the block, mainly us, the Mexicans. And they did it bigger than us, more bolder and more audacious than us, more risk-taking than us, except when I was foreign minister, but other than that, they are the ones who do this better. And so they began to exercise a certain amount of hegemony in Latin America, or at least in South America, if not in Central America, Caribbean, and Mexico. India began to develop its already existing nuclear capability. especially once Pakistan developed its own. And they enhanced their delivery vehicles, their air force, their land army, etc. All these countries began playing an important role or a greater role in all sorts of international endeavors, which I'll come to in a second. And even Russia began once again having a military presence, non-Soviet Union presence, but a military one, and particularly exercising a great deal of leadership and importance as a producer of raw materials, particularly natural gas, for most of Europe. What did these countries want? Well, they wanted to be players. Players, economic players, political players, legal players, and it made a lot of sense. They wanted to have a greater voice in the International Monetary Fund with more voting rights. Until very recently, Belgium had more voting rights in the board of the IMF than China did. And it still has more voting rights than India does, which does make a lot of sense because you don't ask the Belgians for money, but you do go and ask the Chinese for money. And reasonably enough, the Chinese say, sure, I'll give you some money, but what do I get in return? Or you want me to do this out of the kindness of my heart? You think this is where I got to where I am? Being kind? This is not what great powers do. So what are you going to give me? And it all made a lot of sense because there was a fundamental misrepresentation of world powers in the world organizations that had been built up at the end of the war. The UN, the Security Council, the Bretton Woods organizations, which basically the IMF and the World Bank, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which was finally set up at the end of the 1990s. All of these old organizations, because the WTO came from the old GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, all of these old organizations reflected the balance of forces of 1945. And the world had changed for the better. Power had become more dispersed in the world. Countries were growing. Their populations were being brought out of poverty. They were participating more in world trade. They were becoming regional powers. All of this made a lot of sense. And everybody was for it, except for a few people like myself and a few other organizations. I should, in full disclosure, I'm a member of the board of Human Rights Watch, and this is why I particularly emphasize this, but this is a point of view which, up to a point, is shared by many people at Human Rights Watch and also at Amnesty International. On the one hand, yes, these countries should have this greater presence in all of the world order, in world governance. They're big, they're increasingly powerful, they have a role to play, they have been excluded, they should be part of all of this. But what's going to happen to the international legal regime which we have built up over the last 50 years if these guys are allowed in? Is it going to be for the better? Is it going to be neutral? Or is it going to be for the worse? And that began to become a very complicated question. And I'll go through some of the cases, the classic cases, and then talk about a couple of more recent ones, which you've all been following, I'm sure, closely, news and everything. Libya last year and Syria now. But it's not just these cases in the Arab Spring elsewhere. First of all, there's the human rights issue. Does the participation of these countries as more active powers in the UN and everywhere else, World Bank, IMF, WTO, etc., is this good for the international human rights protection regime or bad for it? Well, in two cases, there's no discussion, China and Russia. Particularly China. We know the Chinese don't like human rights, period. I mean, this is not up for discussion. This is not their stuff. This is not what they do. One day they may, the changes may come, but the regime in China is not only contrary to anybody meddling in the human rights situation inside China, but also contrary to the principle of meddling anywhere else in human rights, but also in having a different definition of human rights. According to the Chinese government, on many occasions they have said this, there is a Western definition of human rights, which is just fine. people in the West want to have it, that's their right. Who cares? No skin off their backs. And there is a Chinese definition of human rights, which is different. And they subscribe, obviously, to theirs. The Russian case is very similar. Not because Russia is as authoritarian a regime as China. They do have elections. They have something like a free press, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in general, particularly under President Putin or President Medvedev during the time Putin was prime minister, have not been especially attracted or engaged by the notion of human rights, let alone by an international legal regime which says that human rights are a universal value over and above national sovereignty. That whether some government in some place beats people up is everybody's business. The Chinese and the Russians do not agree with that statement and will not. Well, you say, okay, but what about the Indians? What about South Africans? What about the Brazilians? I mean, these are three democracies. India since independence, since 47. Brazil, certainly since 85, at the end of the military regime. And South Africa ever since Mandela. So maybe the Chinese and the Russians will not contribute to this, but these other three BRICs will. Well, not really. Why? Not because they do not defend human rights domestically. They do. They have no perfect record. No country has a perfect record. The United States doesn't have a perfect record. France doesn't have a perfect record. Germany, Britain doesn't have a perfect record. Nobody does. But these three countries, are decent defenders of human rights domestically. Yes, but they don't like the idea of messing around with the human rights situation of other countries. The Indians don't like it because the Indians were founding members of the non-aligned movement in the early 1950s. The Indians had their own anti-colonial, anti-British independence struggle, I wouldn't call it a war, but struggle, which they won, and which led them to side with other countries where foreign powers meddled. The British did quite a great deal of meddling in India for the previous 2 centuries, one way or another. So the Indians are not terribly excited about that. And the Indians don't like the principle either of having the Western countries decide what human rights are, whether they are being violated in a given country, and what should be done about it. So the Indians were not great fans of this. The Brazilians, for similar reasons, not of decolonization, but of traditional Latin American so-called anti-interventionism. In Latin America, being against intervention, some of my students from last year's honor seminar will remember this, means not being terribly excited about the United States coming and telling you what to do. It's a fancy word for not liking the gringos. And there's a certain logic to that too. There has been so much US intervention in Latin America since at least 1847 or 1836 when Texas seceded from Mexico, that these are not countries that like this a whole lot. And Brazil in particular is hypersensitive. Mexico and Brazil are perhaps the 2 most sensitive countries to this issue. And the South Africans, they're the strangest ones. That's where it's most paradoxical. Why is it most paradoxical? Because they don't like an international human rights regime. They don't like to talk about human rights violations elsewhere in Africa, among other reasons, because they practically happen in every single country in Africa. So they know that it would be a never-ending story. But on the other hand, the ANC and Mandela sought and depended on international support against the fight against apartheid for 30 years. I mean, Mandela was not freed out of the kindness of de Klerk's heart. He was freed because of sanctions, he was freed because of international pressure, he was freed because apartheid had become absolutely intolerable in the world, and he was freed because of the armed struggle that was being waged by the ANC in South Africa, which was supported by all sorts of people. Yes, the Soviets and the Chinese and everybody, but also the Western democracies, one way or the other. So the South Africans should actually be in favor of this, but they're not either. So first problem we have is that on human rights, which is one of the aspects, the main one I'm interested, but it's not the only one. These 5 countries joining the powers that be, being at the table, is not necessarily a good thing for human rights. It may be a good thing for other stuff, but not for that. Well, what about the collective defense of democracy? Something that is increasingly present in the world. When a democratically elected government is overthrown, is that something that should just be allowed to happen, or should the international community, the regional organizations, the UN, whoever, do something about it? Well, these countries don't like that either, for similar reasons. How about climate change and global warming? Perhaps the greatest multilateral challenge that the world is facing or will face over the next 20 or 30 years. Well, strangely enough, for different reasons, but that have to do with the way their civil societies are organized, these countries are not particularly helpful either on these matters. They did not play a particularly constructive role in Copenhagen, for example, partly in defense of their own interests. They are still industrializing, and they say, hey, come on, let us continue to pollute for a while like you guys did until we come up to your levels, and then we'll see. But in the meantime, it's not very nice to tell us you have to stop industrializing, or you have to find a way to industrialize without pollution, which is not easy to do. Well, okay. So it's a reasonable argument, but it's not a terribly constructive one. And then we have a very complicated one, which is also in the news now a great deal, as you may have noticed, which is the question of nuclear non-proliferation. Now, nuclear non-proliferation, meaning other people not having atomic bombs, again, it's one of these fancy names for something simple. No bombs, no nukes, is a very complicated issue ethically or morally. Because in principle, it sounds like a very good idea that since nukes are not a good thing, the fewer people have them, the better it is. Inevitably, some countries got them for one reason or another, but shouldn't let anybody else have them. Sounds reasonable. Except who decides who does and who doesn't? And why is it fair for India and Pakistan, one democracy and one strange sort of thing, sort of a democracy, to have nukes, and Israel, but not Iran, or Brazil, or South Africa, which did actually and destroyed them after the end of apartheid? The nuclear non-proliferation regime, which was established by the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is a regime that these countries do not really actively support. Or they support the letter, but not the spirit or substance of it. Why? Well, because they're not convinced, for example, that it's a good idea to stop Iran from having nuclear weapons at all costs, which is the West's position, and the West being the United States, but not just the United States and Canada. All of the Western Europeans, most of the Eastern Europeans, and a lot of the Arabs, who don't particularly like the Iranians. They're both Muslim, but the Arabs are Arabs, the Iranians are not, and they don't get along very well. They don't like each other a whole lot. And the last thing Saudi Arabia wants is a nuclear Iran. Well, these 5 countries are not great defenders of the non-proliferation regime. And now I'll get into some of the examples of these things that I've been mentioning so we can wind up. At some point 3 years ago, when there was a lot of tension between the US and the Europeans on the one hand, and Iran on the other hand, about the nuclear enrichment program the Iranians have, and whether it's for peaceful purposes or military purposes, the Brazilians and the Turks, by the way, want to become BRICs, but it doesn't work out very well. As you'll see, I'll mention the question of the new Security Council membership very elliptically, but you'll see you can get into all sorts of trouble with the acronyms. You don't want to take it too far. But anyway, right now we're just talking about Turkey. They want to be part of these new group, New Kids on the Block. They want to be part, they're going to come to the table. a country of 80 million people, prosperous, thriving, democracy, etc. Well, they and the Brazilians decided, well, why don't we go to the Iranians and try and suggest some compromise, and then we go to the Europeans and suggest a compromise, and then we go to the Americans and suggest a compromise. And so all of a sudden you had Brazil and Turkey meddling in the Iranian crisis. Turkey is understandable. They're literally next door. They're neighbors. There's a lot of Iranians living in Turkey, and they have the same Kurd issue on both sides of their common border. What in the world the Brazilians had to do meddling or getting involved in whether Iran's nuclear enrichment program was for military purposes or not was beyond anybody's understanding, and particularly beyond the Obama administration's understanding, which got incredibly upset at the Brazilians for meddling with this stuff, particularly when that gave an excuse to the Russians and the Chinese, who don't want to impose sanctions on Iran anyway at the UN Security Council, to say, let's wait, why don't we wait a while? Let's see if the Brazilian-Turkish initiative on Iran works. In whose mind it was going to work was never clear. Nobody ever understood that. But Lula, the president of Brazil at the time, immensely popular, prestigious figure in the world, Turkey and Erdogan were really, among the most attractive people in the new constellation of powers, so you had to let them do that. Okay. But they don't like that stuff. The Indians don't like us messing with the Iranians because they're building gas pipelines and oil pipelines from Iran to India. India is rapidly becoming the world's largest importer of oil and gas because it doesn't have any. The United States imports a whole lot, but it has some. The other countries export. India is a huge importer, and they want to try and import from Iran, which is the closest they have to them with oil and gas. And so they want a cozy relationship with Iran. The Brazilians were fooling around for these reasons. The Chinese and the Russians do not want to get involved in the Iranian crisis, and they have systematically either vetoed any sanctions at the Security Council or watered them down so much that they become less functional, less effective. So while President Obama and the French and the Germans every now and then say, let's give sanctions more time, every time Netanyahu comes to Washington or to New York and starts making a fuss about this, which is roughly every other weekend. That's what he does now. He's got this frequent flyer obsession. And I mean, this is what he does in life. Okay, so he comes here, he complains, Obama gets upset. Obama says, let's give the sanctions more time. In order to make them more time, let's toughen the sanctions, go to the Security Council, try and toughen them. The Russians and the Chinese say no, and any one of the BRICs that is still there also say no. The Indians are still in the Security Council, they say no. The Brazilians have left, but the South Africans are still in the Security Council, and they say no. And the Pakistanis now, who joined the council, Brazil left, they say no. No question of letting the Pakistanis join the BRICs because, as you'll see, it wouldn't work. You can figure that one out for yourselves, the students. Syria and Libya, what's called R2P, which is responsibility to protect. What happened in Libya now more than a year ago? Well, after the Arab Spring, uprisings, etc., civil war, and finally a resolution called Resolution 1973, the Security Council authorized the use of force to ensure a no-fly zone to protect civilians under the doctrine known as responsibility to protect, or in this UN acronym jargon, R2P. I told you it's incomprehensible, and the UN people love these things. So they came up with this, they sent it to the Security Council. It took months and months to get the Security Council to approve a resolution allowing the use of force in Libya to protect the people who were being fired upon or massacred, or whatever term you'd like to use, by Gaddafi. Why did it take months? Well, one reason it took months was because, yes, the Chinese and the Russians were vetoing. Okay, but everybody more or less knew that. And the Americans have ways of talking about these things with the Chinese and the Russians, because the US-Chinese and US-Russian agenda is so complicated that you can trade one thing for another. Okay, I'll give you Libya if you let me beat up the Estonians or whatever, or Tibet. It doesn't make any difference. But you also had 3 other countries who were members of the Council at the same time: India, Brazil, and South Africa. And they also said no. And so when finally Resolution 1973 was approved, because the Chinese and the Russians went along with it, 3 countries abstained: Brazil, South Africa, and India. So first question, why in the world do you want to be members of the Security Council if when you're there, you abstain? Is that what this is all about? You want to be invited to dinner and not eat anything? It's ridiculous. But more importantly, they showed there that they don't want to get involved in this. Finally, Libya went ahead, and then these 3 countries, plus the Chinese and the Russians, decided that they had been tricked, that they had been snookered by the Western powers, and that the Western powers had passed a resolution for R2P, protecting civilian lives, that in fact was a resolution for regime change. And that, okay, well, this happened to them on Libya, but it was not going to happen on Syria. End of story. Never again will we support this stuff. And one of the reasons why we have had now what's been going on in Syria for the last year or so, with all the deaths and all the murder and all the torture, is because not only the Chinese and the Russians keep vetoing, but because the Brazilians aren't there anymore, but the South Africans and the Indians, and the Brazilians in principle, they matter, don't like this stuff. Where does this take us? Well, I'll end with Brazil, because this is stuff that we, in Mexico, we enjoy doing. We like Brazil bashing because we're terribly jealous of them, fundamentally for 3 reasons. And these are important things. 1, they're infinitely better soccer players than we are. 2, they are infinitely better dancers than we are. And 3, they tell their story better than we do. And we don't like that. So we're very upset at them. And so every time we have a chance to say that when they make fools of themselves, and we have a chance to show it, we do. Let me read to you what President Rousseff said at Harvard 2 weeks ago on human rights. If I can find this thing. Okay. She was giving a talk there, and the question was, in response to a question about a political prisoner in Venezuela and what she thought about that. First, I'd like to say that I have great respect for Hugo Chavez and do not give myself the right to make recommendations for any country, for that is dangerous, and I wouldn't like others to make comments about my country. From Brazil's perspective, we will defend human rights whenever we can and have the opportunity to do so. However, I must say there is much disrespect for human rights in Brazil. I cannot prevent torture at all Brazilian police stations. I may not know about the prison you mentioned in Venezuela, but I do know what happens at Guantanamo and other prisons. But I consider that human rights cannot be the object of a political battle, and I will not engage in one because I do not believe that there is only one country or group of countries that violates human rights. Human rights should always be discussed multilaterally because they are often used as an instrument of politics. The president of Brazil speaking 10 days ago at Harvard. What does this mean and why is it important? Well, because I think it's both an example of the challenge that I've tried to sum up, that if these countries want to join the world governance table, I think they should accept the world governance table's rules, the rules of engagement that have been built up very slowly over 50 years, and by the way, which they have benefited from. Because when Dilma Rousseff was in prison in the 1970s and being tortured for being a guerrilla fighter or member of a guerrilla group under the military dictatorship, countries and groups of civil society and students all over the world were denouncing the Brazilian military dictatorship and helping to eventually free people like Dilma Rousseff from jail. Not to mention, as I already did, Mandela. So this is the nature of the challenge. But I think Rousseff's comments in Harvard are also an example of why things are beginning to change. Why are they beginning to change? Because she does have to go to Harvard. And when she or to NYU. And when she does, she will be asked questions on Brazil's stance, on Venezuela, on Cuba, on Iran, on Syria, on Libya, and she will have to answer. And then people back home, 14 Brazilian NGOs, human rights NGOs, issued a letter back in Brazil protesting over this, what they consider to be an extraordinary statement by their president at a place like Harvard. So she now is paying a cost for this type of stance. The Indians have begun to change their stance, for example, on Sri Lanka. There was a civil war in Sri Lanka until 5 years ago with the so-called Tamil Tigers. Finally, the Sri Lankan government won together along with Indian support, military support. And the Sri Lankan government then locked up the 500,000 demobilized Tamil Tiger troops, locked them up in concentration camps and threw the key away. And they've been there ever since. And India has not said a word about that, or had not said a word about it. Finally, at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, UN Human Rights Council in Geneva a couple of months ago, they voted in favor of a resolution urging the Sri Lankan government to free the Tamil Tigers who were still in the concentration camps. On Syria, things are beginning to move. The Russians and the Chinese finally accepted the Annan plan for Syria. The observers are being sent in slowly. They can only observe what the other guys want them to see. They can't observe everything. Not very nice, not very effective, but better. Little by little, things are moving. Why are they moving? For two reasons. One, because there is such a thing as international civil society, and these countries who want to become real players are understanding that international civil society has to accept them as real players, because if not, the governments of the countries where much of international civil society exists will not let them in, will not invite them to dinner. And two, perhaps more importantly, because in each one of these countries, there is beginning to be an awakening of civil society on these issues also. Saying, yes, the Brazilians say, it is everybody else's business if we tear down the Amazon, because it is the world's lung. And it's everybody's. It happens to be in Brazil, yes, but we can't do with it whatever we want. And it's us Brazilians who are saying that, not the Danish or the Dutch or the Norwegians or all these people who are 10,000 miles away. No, it's Brazilians who are saying it. And I think this is beginning to change this configuration. It will take a while. And during that while, I think that, this is my final opinion, I think that these countries should not be let in until they adhere to these standards, and they will not until international and their national civil societies force them to do so. Thank you very, very much.
Well, it's very clear why Jorge is not only a foreign minister, but a professor. He not only has unbelievably deep understanding of global politics, but he also has an uncanny ability to explain them to those of us who have lesser experience. So I invite you for 5 or 10 minutes if we have questions, and then of course you can visit with him privately in the reception. But if there's a question or two, we'd be delighted to take them.
Regarding the recent meeting of the Organization of American States, and a lot of the Latin American countries wanted to invite Cuba to sit at the table at the next meeting. What are your feelings or opinions on maybe inviting Cuba as an observer or under stipulations of them being allowed at the table if they meet certain, the principles of the charter, being more democratic or allowing more freedom of the press or things of that sort?
Well, I don't know, does this thing work? Yeah. What I would have brought up as another example, if I had a little more time, is what just happened at the Cartagena summit in Colombia last weekend. You may have heard about it. Apparently other things happened too. More newsworthy than. But one of the things that happened was that most of the Latin Americans said that Cuba should have been invited this time. Obama said, no, if they are, I won't go. And they caved in this time. But they insisted that Cuba be invited next time in Panama from 3 years from now. And Obama and the Canadians sort of said, look, if you do that and nothing happens in Cuba between now and then, we won't go. Well, it's the same principle. In other words, when the summit, the Summit of the Americas, was held in Quebec City in 2001, Latin America had just approved a thing called the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which clearly said that only democratically elected presidents or leaders could attend these summits or could attend other meetings of this sort. There are a bunch of other groups in Latin America where these guys, everybody can go. But that this in particular, and the OAS in general, was for democratically elected leaders. Now, you can have a broad definition of that. For example, you can think that if your elder brother chooses you, that's a democratically elected leader because he chose you democratically. But most of the time, that's not going to work. That's not a great idea. So, if you go by principle, Raul Castro should not have been invited this time and should not be invited next time if he's still around. Conversely, if you go by geopolitics, there's no good reason for not inviting the Cubans, because frankly, at this stage, what kind of government the Cubans have, nobody cares about, one way or the other, except for the dissidents in Cuba and some people in Miami. So what do you do with that? What is the solution? I think that the Latin Americans should have been much clearer on this issue, the other ones. They should have told Obama, we want you to lift the embargo, but we want them to have elections. And if you lift the embargo and they have elections, we will all go to the next summit and they will go too. But if you don't lift the embargo and they don't have elections, then they can't come. That's what I would have done, but that's not where the Latin Americans are right now, largely because of the Brazilians. Chavez a little bit too, but Chavez doesn't have the clout the Brazilians have. So we come back to the same principle.
Professor, nice to see you back. I just want
We'll see after your question.
I just want to ask, because President Krishna is democratically elected, but many of her policies not so democratically orientated. Should you impose sanctions on Argentina because of their undemocratic and uncapitalistic behaviors?
Well, it's more complicated. I mean, you have two real issues, and for example, Secretary Clinton has gotten into this every now and then. Sometimes it works out okay for her, sometimes it doesn't. Which is, one thing is being democratically elected, and another is to govern democratically. And it is true that you have a number of cases in the world where the two things don't necessarily go together. Now, the case specifically of Argentina, I think you have two different issues. One, whether they have been incurring in policies or acts or measures which violate the Inter-American Democratic Charter or not. I think it's a stretch right now to say so. I don't think that until now, really, you can go that far. Venezuela is more complicated, Ecuador is more complicated, but Argentina, I think, is a bit of a stretch in political terms. Now, if you go to the economic side, there you have a different story. Because if they do end up nationalizing the Spanish oil company's holdings, and they don't pay a cent, then they are violating a series of international economic commitments that they themselves made. Nobody imposed them on them. They agreed to a series of forms of arbitration, compensation for expropriation, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a different type of sanction. What would happen at the World Bank? Well, this is an issue, because that's where the arbitration is supposed to take place. But they are two separate situations, and I think they should be kept separately, although I do support human rights and democracy conditionality in the world financial institutions. Because I don't see why in the world you do that against apartheid in South Africa, and you don't do it if there's a coup tomorrow in Venezuela against a left-wing government, and they install some sort of right-wing military dictatorship that starts killing all the Chavistas. Well, that country should not get loans from the World Bank just because it would be pursuing free market policies, et cetera. You have to have the same standard, I think, for everybody. Sorry.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I found your lecture very informative, and there's something that's sort of niggling me in the back of my head, though, and that is the argument you make is based on we're not really sure about these P5s. We don't know where they stand. The thing that distresses me is that when one looks at the list of things you addressed in the lecture, human rights, democratic governance, behavior at climate change summits or positions that are taken, nuclear non-proliferation, I kind of, from the position I stand in, I come from a country where I grew up under a dictatorship that was put in place by 2 members of the Security Council and kept in place until I was 19 years old. And I had soldiers come to my home. I fought for the right to vote. And at the global climate change summits, I have not seen consistency. I have not seen whether it's climate change, whether it's choosing which human rights issue to address in which country, whether it's which undemocratic government to be upset with. I have not seen consistency in the current members of the Security Council. And I don't think that in the case of Iran, it would be unreasonable for anyone in the world to want to be cautious when we have just had Iraq, which was justified war on the basis of the presence of nuclear weapons, which in the end everybody got told, oops, sorry, actually they weren't really there. Okay, these are very serious issues. If we're going to judge countries on the basis of whether they're going to be a member of the Security Council as to where they stand, we have to account for the consistency and the selective conduct of those who exist presently. Because ultimately what we're saying is the integrity of the particular country that gives it its credibility at the council, not so much a series of rules that define how anyone should behave when they're there, regardless of who they are. And therefore, I'd like you to address this question of consistency and selectiveness. Thank you.
I think it's a very well-phrased question, but take it further. It's not just the Security Council. The inconsistency by the United States, France, Britain, the Western Europeans, even the Canadians, a little bit less the Canadians, in all honesty. Not that I'm a big Canadian fan, but yes, they're consistent. It's worse than that, because at the Human Rights Commission and then Council, or at any of these at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which the United States still has not ratified. At all of these instances, the United States, Britain, and France have been remarkably inconsistent over the past 50 years. Much more so 20 or 30 years ago during the Cold War, of course, than now, but they're still inconsistent. Time and again, they do not abide by their own standards. And what President Rousseff says about Guantanamo is not totally false. It's different, but she's not wrong. She has a point. So I certainly agree with you that there is an issue of consistency, and there is an issue of trying to hold these countries to the standards that they have largely set themselves. What is the difference, I think? I think certainly the difference with China and Russia is very clear. That here in the United States, Americans were able, after a while, and maybe too long, yes, to vote out the governments or the parties that took them into Iraq and vote in somebody who took them out of Iraq. Sent them to Afghanistan, different story, but still, at least took them out of Iraq. and that you do have civil society here demonstrating and complaining and suing and denouncing and writing and doing all sorts of things, which at the end of the day are the only things which really help. The same is true in Britain, the same is true in France, the same is true in most of Western Europe. I mean, it took 3 or 4 years of very violent demonstrations and everything to finally get the French to leave Algeria. It took a war plus a semi-war in France, a war in Algeria and a semi-war in France. But at the end of the day, they left Algeria. And they left because they were forced to leave, partly by the war in Algeria, but partly by the mass demonstrations and opposition in France. This is what I think is so important, why I agree with the consistency argument, but I think we should take it beyond that. Yes, consistency on the part of the Western powers to abide by the standards that they have elaborated, yes, but also consistency on the part of mainly the third world democracies to allow for the development and strengthening of civil society, which then turns this into an issue, a domestic issue that they have to actually pay attention to. But I agree with your point very much, and very well made, by the way.
I can't imagine a better way to end our formal presentation. Would you join me one more time in thanking them?
Thank you. How did you leave him?